So I'm going to switch gears now, and I'm going to talk to you as quickly as I can with some solution ideas. So if drinking the mammary gland secretions of another species was a reliable way to prevent bone fracture, we know that the populations that consume the most milk would have the strongest bones, and they'd be free of this disease, right? But we know just the opposite is what we see. So we can take that myth and we can extinguish that. Let's just get rid of that right now. Because living in that mythology then exposes us to, in each glass, nearly 60 different hormones and growth factors, about 30 different bovine proteins that can elicit an allergic reaction in us, some subtle, some very serious, a vast array of chemical contaminants that are found to consistently concentrate in milk and dairy products, lactose, which is indigestible by 75% of the population of this planet, and results in sorts of gastrointestinal distress. And milk may very well be a disease vector. Now, we talked about MAP and Crohn's, but we haven't talked about bovine leukemia and bovine AIDS and all the bacterial contamination. So let's stop talking about milk. Because milk is a distraction. It's a big distraction from where our minds should really be focused if what we care about is bone health. Okay? Osteoporosis is what we call a multifactorial disease. There are numerous factors that come together to produce risk of developing the condition. And therefore, the silver bullet approach, which we've been using now for way too long, which is drowning the body in ever-increasing levels of calcium, doesn't work. It doesn't work any more than drowning the body in huge amounts of dietary protein in hopes that you're going to build muscle. Doesn't work. Muscle's got to be stimulated. It's got to have resistance. It's got to have force put on it, and that's how it gets bigger and stronger. It's the same way with bone. Bone has to be stimulated and have stress put on it if it's going to become stronger and be more fracture resistant. So if we look at this idea of just cramming calcium down our throat and trying to prevent a disease, again, we're distracted from the fact that bone health is not just about calcium. Bone health is about 17 some nutrients that are all involved that must be present in adequate quantities for the body to build bone. Our body's rebuilding our skeleton 6 times entirely over our lifetime, constantly remodeling. Osteoclast breaking down old bone, osteoblast building up new bone. But there's so much more than calcium. There's copper, and there's zinc, and there's boron, and there's magnesium, and manganese, and phosphorus, and essential fats, and vitamin C, and D, and B6, and B12. It's all got to be there. And that's what we never hear about. So it's interesting when you look at these surveys that are done. There have been 2 multinational studies have been published since 1992. One was 92, Calcified Tissue International. They looked all around the world, and they looked at the highest incidence of hip fracture, and they looked at animal protein intake in the diet. The higher the animal protein intake, the higher the incidence of hip fracture. And the inverse was so. The lower the animal protein intake, the lower the incidence of hip fracture. And then UCSF, University of California, San Francisco researchers put another study together, same kind of way, and they found that the people that consumed the most animal protein had almost a 4 times elevated risk of suffering a hip fracture compared to those who were eating the least. And we don't have to get caught up in the mechanism as to why, because since 1988, there have been 87, 88, 89 studies published, all of which have shown that as the diet is richer in fruits and vegetables and antioxidants, the bones get bigger and more fracture resistant. Over and over and over again, these studies show this. But you don't hear about it. That's because the Fed spends about $3 million a year promoting the consumption of fruits and vegetables. And the dairy industry spends about 50 times that much, about 150 million a year, convincing you to consume milk. And the reason is this is where all the bone nutrients are. This is where they're concentrated. So when we make a decision to have the bacon cheeseburger, we move ourselves farther away from bone health. When we enrich our diet with fruits and vegetables, plant foods that are full of all of these important nutrients, plus the phytochemicals, we move ourselves closer to bone health. Okay? And I go into a lot of detail about this in Whitewash, but I want to just talk to you about a couple things I call bone robbers, which are not discussed very often. Before I do that, I want to make a statement about vitamin D. If you haven't seen, these surveys over and over again are showing that we have broad-spread vitamin D deficiency in our society, and there may be any number of reasons responsible for this. It could be that we're not getting outdoors as much as we should, because vitamin D, of course, is produced by exposure to sun. It could be that when we're outdoors, we're covered up and we're wearing sunscreens to avoid sun exposure, because obviously people are concerned about skin cancer. But vitamin D is absolutely essential to not only bone health, but to a number of other things that are becoming apparent. And without adequate vitamin D, we can't absorb the calcium and integrate it into our bones. So it is a really important element that I'm going to recommend you get checked out, because you don't know. You might be producing sufficient levels of vitamin D, but the best way to know is talk to your health practitioner and ask them, can I get a vitamin D test, find out what your levels are, and then work with them, because supplementation of vitamin D is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. If I take 1,000 IUs of vitamin D and you take it, we're going to have a different response in terms of boosting our levels of vitamin D in the body. So you want to find out what you need, what would be a reasonable or appropriate supplementation level, and work with somebody who can track that with you, okay? Then I want to talk to you about a handful of bone robbers, one being alcohol. Alcohol, obviously in our society, we don't think a lot about having a couple of glasses of wine with dinner or a couple of beers at the ball game or what have you, but alcohol does, it's hard on bone. It's hard on bone for a number of reasons. It interferes with the proper function of osteoblast cells, which are required to build up new bone. It causes the body to excrete important bone nutrients like calcium, magnesium, copper, and zinc, vitamin C. It also can interfere with the production of certain enzymes that are necessary for the metabolism of vitamin D, so our body can actually use the form that it does. And of course, alcohol places us at risk of falling because we lose our sense of stability with alcohol. And why is that important? Well, in 90% of the hip fractures that we see, there's a fall that precipitates it. So what we've got to be looking at is how do we prevent falls in the first place, in addition to these other lifestyle changes that we can do to minimize our risk of developing osteoporosis. Next thing I want to talk to you about is sodium. We all know about sodium. We know we consume a lot of sodium. And this plays a role in bone disease as well. We know that after about 2,400 milligrams of sodium intake, for every 500 additional milligrams of sodium we're exposed to, we lose about 10 milligrams of calcium. We excrete about 15 milligrams of calcium from caffeine. From a couple of cups of coffee, you lose about 15 milligrams of calcium a day. And that's, cups of coffee. You say people are nursing these towers of coffee around these days, like 64 ounces or multiples of them. So think about the kind of how much caffeine you may be exposed to in a day, what you're consuming. Think about the alcohol, the sodium. Every 500 milligrams over 2,400, you're losing about 10 milligrams of calcium. When you look at a bacon cheeseburger, about 1,400 milligrams of sodium right there. And that's just one thing. So many of us could be thousands and thousands of milligrams of sodium in excess of our needs, and thereby playing a role in calcium losses. And I want to talk to you about medications. We've known for years that certain medications like corticosteroids were really hard on bone, elevate risk of fracture. And we know that some of the cardiac medications that are very popular in this country also cause a problem with bone health. And now the class of antidepressants, which are very widely prescribed in the U.S., the SSRIs, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it seems to be that after about 5 years of use, there's a doubling in the risk of hip fracture. So the take-home on all this is have a conversation with your healthcare provider, because if you are on medications of various sorts, there may be medications you can take that will produce the same outcome, have the same effect that you're looking for, but they're not the class of drug that's hard on your bone and may be increasing your risk of fracture. And then the final thing is sedentary living, exercise. And I can imagine some of you are thinking, exercise, schmexercise, I'm so tired of hearing about exercise. But there's so many benefits. There are just so many benefits to exercise, to moving our bodies. And this is a huge player in regards to bone health. Do not underestimate this. I can't overemphasize it here today. You know, if you've ever had a limb in a cast. When I was 9, I had an arm cast, and I'll never forget when they sawed it off. I was just stunned. It was like this noodle in there. I said, what happened to my arm? And they said, well, you know, it shrank, but it'll come back. Well, it shrank. We call that muscular atrophy. It shrank because of disuse. It wasn't being stimulated, and the muscle shrank. And bone does the same thing. With disuse, it demineralizes, and it gets smaller and weaker and more prone to fracture. When we don't use our bones, we're placing ourselves at this risk. So bone responds to stress that's placed on it, weight bearing. And, you know, we learned from the astronauts when they first started going into extended orbits, they'd come back and they could barely walk because they had lost lots of their bone mass. And they weren't stimulating their bones and their muscles. And now they have special equipment to keep their bones and muscles healthy while they're in these extended orbits. But we know that top athletes have 50%, they have 50% greater bone mass. We know that people that aren't athletes, that are just the most active in our society, they've got 40% greater bone mass than sedentary people. But the CDC says that 55% of us don't get the basic amount of exercise to ward off chronic degenerative disease. And a full 26% don't get any exercise at all. Just the basic movements. I call them chair people. You know, they move from the chair at the office to the chair at the dinner table to the chair in front of the TV to the chair in the car to the... And the body's not getting stimulated. You've got to work out the bones. You've got to stimulate them. You've got to find ways every day. You're given an option. You got an elevator. You got stairs. Take the stairs. Make an investment in your health. Okay? And this is really powerful. It doesn't matter how old you are. There have been tens of thousands of people who have been looked at all over the world. And they've shown that people, even in their 7th and 8th decade of life, if they're put on an exercise regimen, they can build bone mass in as little as a year. And they can build anywhere from 1% to 8% we've seen in people in their 70s and 80s. Now, what does that equate to in terms of your risk of suffering a fracture? Well, we figure that for each 1% that you increase your bone mass, you reduce your risk of fracture by about 6%. So let's just be conservative and say you employ an exercise regime and regimen and you build up your bone mass by 5% over the next year, by the end of 2014. Theoretically, you've reduced your risk of fracture by 30%. You haven't looked at alcohol, you haven't looked at sodium, you haven't looked at your bigger dietary plan, these other factors, you haven't looked at medications. This is really, really important stuff to look at, okay? So give some thought to what kind of an exercise program you can incorporate into your life where you're doing something at least a few days a week, if not every day of the week. And then finally, do I have a couple more minutes? Okay. I just want to close by saying, you know, every day in this country, well-intentioned, highly qualified, well-credentialed healthcare authorities look at their patients, their clients, and say, you need to increase your milk consumption. They look at women who have become pregnant and they say, okay, it's time to bone up. You're building a new skeleton. Let's get you on the plan. Yogurt, cheese, milk every day. Or they say, Johnny is not going to grow up healthy and strong unless you make sure he's getting this milk. And I think I understand it. Because these folks grew up steeped in the same mythology that we did. And they believe that the advice that they're giving is helpful to their clients, to their patients. But I think it's really tragic that the people to whom we entrust our health, that we seek out advice about decisions to make how to protect our health, are still perpetuating this mythology, are still telling people that something is going to go wrong with them because they're not nursing from another species. There are 5,400 different mammalian species that we know of on this planet. And in every instance, these mammals produce milk for their offspring. But in every instance, that milk is nutritionally unique. It means the balance of the constituents in there vary according to the needs of that species. So it's species specific. So rats' milk is exceptionally high in protein because rats double their birth weight in 4 days. We double our birth weight in 180. And whale milk is exceptionally rich in fat because it has a consistency of mayonnaise. A baby whale has to develop blubber to survive in the cold water environment that it lives in. So whales aren't drinking cow's milk, and cows aren't drinking goat's milk, and elephants aren't drinking the milk of hippos. We're the only ones that do this. And I really believe that the sooner that we step back from this, the sooner that we leave this mythology behind, the sooner we can reclaim the health that we have forfeited all these years being wrapped up in this myth. Thank you. Yes.
Great speech. I am a little hard of hearing.
So am I.
So maybe next time turn the volume up a little bit. But I want to ask Howard Lehman. He was on Oprah.
Yes.
And it was talked about mad cow disease. And mad cow disease, another name for it is Alzheimer's. Is this transferred through the milk also?
I don't. Obviously, Howard Lyman is kind of a leading authority on prion disease. He knows a great deal about it. I do not. I do know that mad cow disease was found in some dairy cattle, and they kind of followed the thread back of where they were sourced and said they came from Canada, that we imported them from Canada. I do not know. I don't have the information to know about whether prion disease can be passed on by way of milk, but there's a lot of disease in the dairy herds in the U.S. that's just not talked about. The bovine leukemic virus. There was a study done where they tested people and found that they had antibodies to bovine leukemia. Well, then they're getting exposed. Now, people will tell you, well, you don't have to worry about that because of pasteurization, and we really don't know if it crosses species. Well, we know we've infected chimpanzees with bovine leukemic virus, and they share a lot of genetic background with us. But these things are hard to come across. They're not being talked about readily, but I think it's something to definitely be cautious about. Again, the bovine leukemia is, well, it's being pasteurized so it kills the virus. But what about the milk that gets out? You've read the stories. Oh, unfortunately, we're recalling this unpasteurized milk that got to market a week later. was a big recall a couple years ago in Chicago. Well, what about that? So what do we do about if, BLV was in that milk and got to market and people drank it? Sorry, I can't be more specific to your question. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. Question about the bone robbers. You had not mentioned carbonated drinks, so I was wondering about what that was. And also, on Dr. Oz, it approved 15 minutes in the tanning bed for vitamin D. I don't know what you think about that. And just wondering about, the WIC program.
The which program?
The WIC program for women, low income. They're given these tickets that they can go to the grocery store and purchase milk and eggs and dairy, cheese. What if we somehow could change that and they only can get greens,
I love your thinking. I love your thinking, yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate that a lot of the surplus foods that are given to children and low-income people are the very foods that we shouldn't be eating in the first place, that are going to send them down that same disease path that we see so much of in this country. I don't know about that. There's, as far as the vitamin D, I myself have not looked into what has been referred to as safe tanning beds. I really can't speak to that with any knowledge. I think the vitamin D supplement is one way that everybody can go. Some people have no problem with going out and getting sun exposure. I can't. I got my lifetime dose. I've got skin cancer, and I got to be very, very careful, so I have to use a supplement. But I think it is tragic that a lot of these programs, well-intending again, wow, we're gonna make sure that they're having a healthy diet and getting the calories they need every day, but it's just the wrong foods that we're providing. Sorry. Yes?
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of the kids today, the young people, they don't breastfeed anymore. So you have formula for the first, 6 months of life, and then they go right into milk. So if the recommendation is no milk, then what do you feed the young people? Do the babies, kids 6 months and older, do they just need water and give them a good diet, or is there something else that you would recommend? This
is tragic that we make breastfeeding seem like something of the past, a chore. I've been told I have to stop, so maybe what I can do is meet you. I'm sorry, I didn't see where you went, but I can meet you in the back and we can talk about this in a little more detail. Okay, I'm compliant. I'll follow the request.